So as an introduction to my thesis, I'm going to read a paper I wrote placing my work in a better historical and literary context for everyone. Then I'll jump into the opening chapters of my novel. So, the genre of fantasy has roots that span all the way back to the first tale in recorded history, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The stories evolved with humanity, but people never lost their thirst for the fantastical. Homer, Shakespeare, and many other authors added new pieces to the tapestry of this literature. Then, J.R.R. Tolkien provided future writers with a template for what would become known as high fantasy with The Lord of the Rings. In the years since Tolkien, the genre became dominated by a few major elements from his work. My high fantasy novel, The Swords of Fellowship, puts a modern twist on the setting, characters, dragons, and villains, while continuing the epic traditions of the genre. To understand how my novel fits into and updates high fantasy, we must first explore the genre's nuts and bolts. With specific races, Lisa Sharon says of the genre, at its core is the battle of good versus evil, and the stakes are high, with specific races, civilization, or even the entire world at risk. High fantasy usually takes place in a quasi-medieval or Renaissance world. Quests and magic are an integral part of the plot. The classic example of this is J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. This encapsulates a good high-level overview of the genre, but it's missing one element. Author Ursula K. Le Guin supplied it when she created a definition for high fantasy based off negative stereotypical assumptions. She said that in this genre, it's often assumed that the characters are white. Now we should have a good grasp on what people typically think of when they envision high fantasy. As mentioned above, one of the recognizable things about the genre is that its writers are obsessed with a world stuck in the Dark Ages. The largest way in which I chose to inject modernity into the genre was by setting my story in a technological age that exists as an analog to our own time and place. Along with modernizing the setting, I also updated a staple of the high fantasy genre. Instead of world building through fictional historical textbooks, as many fantasy writers do, I created Wikipedia-style entries that provide insight into my world. These appear at the end of every chapter. With this modern world comes modern problems. Elves, dwarfs, and humans have spent thousands of years trying to cohabitate in the world of Elwarran. There have been mistakes made by all parties at one time or another, and some mistakes have been bigger than others. My antagonist, Terowyn, holds on to a grudge against humans and dwarfs that dates back over 200 years. Fantasy often serves to use different fantastical races to reflect reality. William Taylor noted that Tolkien amplifies social, national, and racial differences into differences of species. Trolls are opposed to Ents, orcs to elves and dwarfs. Ultimately, this story is about how people can overcome the mistakes of the past. This serves a real and tangible purpose because, if we can understand Ents or elves in an imaginary world, perhaps we can better understand each other in our own country. When I set out to write The Swords of Fellowship, I wanted to ensure my cast of characters was not filled with typical white male fantasy stereotypes. As Lawrence Yep said, multiculturalism is more than a buzzword. It is the dynamo that drives America forward. Since I have lived my entire life in the United States, I wanted to create a fantasy world that reflected our diversity. Thus, my protagonist, Heath, is not white. His greatest ally is a female elf named Tresembur, who is no damsel in distress. Characters who will take center stage in future novels and appear as important secondary characters in this novel would be identified as members of the LGBTQ community in our world. The one character who does fill a traditional fantasy role is Heath's dwarf friend Grimm. But all my characters live in a realm populated with socioeconomic tensions, much like our own country. All of them are intricately developed and realized for my novel to avoid trading and stock character cutouts. While my fantasy tale does not comment directly on our country's current climate, I think it would be almost impossible not to see the parallels between America and Elwarran. The modern twists in my novel do not just extend to the setting and diverse characters, they extend to the dragons. In my tale, dragons are ferocious beasts, but they only need to be feared when they are used for evil purposes by my antagonist. In fact, one forms a close bond with my hero. As Sandra Unerman says, the changing role of dragons in modern fiction expresses deeper changes in society, as well as approaches to fiction and a change in attitude towards dangerous animals. In today's first world, we are often more concerned with preserving the great animals we once feared, and that is reflected in the Swords of Fellowship. Unerman also sums up my thoughts of presenting modern dragons when she says, fictional evil is more convincing and more frightening when people, not dragons, are the true enemy. This is the primary reason why dragons are not simply fire-breathing impediments in my novel. These beasts are a part of nature in Elwarran, and just like nature in our world, they are not evil, but they can be destructive when they catch us off guard. Vigilance and respect are what we need to combat the dangers of nature in reality, and dragons in my fantasy realm. Now that fire drakes are safe from being blamed for evil in my novel, we can move on to the actual cause of it. Villains are one of the most important parts of any good story where two foes face off. They often set the plot in motion, but they can easily be presented as generic, simple, evil machines. My antagonist, Terwin, is relatable, cunning, and his motivations are justified from a slightly skewed point of view. He wants to return Elwaran to elf rule, because when humans and dwarfs were previously left to steward the continent in his race's absence, they caused an ecological disaster. Lucia Owen states that in fantasy novels, the forces of good rule through a harmonious relationship to nature. The evil forces seek to violate or pervert the natural law. This is true in my novel, but I add a modern twist. In the Swords of Fellowship, the forces of good rule through a harmonious relationship to each other. A council and senate of dwarfs, humans, and elves drives policy and keeps the peace. Terwin seeks to divide those relationships in order to put elves in charge. He also seeks to pervert natural law by harnessing elemental powers from swords that were crafted by dwarves, imbued with magic by elves, and made to be wielded by humans. To gain literal control over nature, he must destroy these swords, which stand as a symbol for Elwaran's racial unity. While I've described Terwin as my novel's villain and Heath as my novel's hero, neither of these descriptions are entirely accurate because of another way in which I modernize my fantasy characters. Ursula K. Le Guin said it best when she said, "I don't write about battles or wars at all." Instead, she says, what I write about, like most novelists, is people making mistakes, and other people are the same people, trying to prevent or correct those mistakes, while inevitably making more mistakes. All my characters have the opportunity to make better choices in the novel, and their refusal to rise above their selfish impulses, some relatable and some not, are what create and drive the story forward to its conclusion, where I divert from Le Guin a tad by writing about a large-scale battle. But this fight is not about good versus evil. It's about ego versus ego, and neither participant is a true winner. In conclusion, The Swords of Fellowship modernizes multiple aspects of the high fantasy genre. It presents a technologically modern world populated with diverse characters reflecting our country. Dragons are not just represented as monsters, instead they are shown to be as friendly or deadly as any real animal. My primary antagonist, Terwin, is a complicated character, and other characters populating the story contain various levels of intricacy too. None of them are simply good or evil. Finally, despite all these modern insertions, readers will still be able to identify a lot of classic fantasy tropes that keep my story tied to the wonderful traditions of the genre. There is a quest narrative, a kind of fellowship, magic swords, epic scale, and a dark force reawoken by the novel's end.